Hi, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show some example Python functions in Blender, and I might do a separate video on how to create custom libraries, but for now I'm just going to briefly show how I load in functions from different scripts. So here at the top of my script I'm using the import lib module, and these lines point to a library called Modu, and that's right here. And at the top of this file I've defined my directories, and here I load the rest of my custom libraries. Python loads standard Python functions. The engine library is math functions, and the Blender library is Blender functions. And here I use the function tools module to link these different libraries together. So here at the top of my Blender library I have these linker functions like Python link, and I set this Python parameter to none because this script has no reference to the Python library, but function tools will kind of assert that parameter, so it loads the Python library here and then passes it to the Blender library here. So if I need the Python library in one of these functions, like here for example, I call this Python function, and to get a reference to the Python library I have to first call this Python link function. And another thing that import lib is good for is for loading a script in Blender. So here I'm using import lib to point to my main file, which is where I'm calling my Blender functions from. And the reason I do that is because in Blender, every time you make a change to a script, you have to reload that script. But if you do it this way, then your loader script stays constant and never changes. So you can make changes in like an external text editor, and you just have to save it, and you won't have to keep reloading it constantly. So I'm going to load my blend file, which is here, and I've already opened the load.py file, so I won't have to keep reloading that. So starting with my Blender functions, I have the select function, which is the function that I use the most. A lot of other functions expect an object to be selected before they're called, so before an operation is run, the object has to be selected first. Select other selects an object from a different scene. Select all is just a shortcut for Blender's select all function. And to parent a child to another object, first select the child and then call parent and pass the name of the parent. Parent clears the parent of the selected object. Join will join the selected object to the named object. Duplicate is a shortcut, so is delete. Scale passes a tuple to the resize function. Rota calls rotate, and it has a pivot option. Pivot is if, for example, you are importing a set of objects into a new scene and you wanted to rotate all the objects around the same pivot point so that their relative transformation stays constant. Rotaset sets the selected object's rotation. Locus sets the location, and transform sets all three, and move calls translate. The apply functions apply the scale, rotation, and location of an object, and converts a curve to a mesh. Cursor sets the location of the cursor, and cursor read reads it. Cursor to selected does what it sounds like. Cursor to vertex moves the cursor to the selected vertex, And like all the functions in this library, it's called in object mode and not in edit mode. Origin to cursor and origin to geometry are shortcuts. Origin sets the selected object's origin to the past location. Origin copy is the same, except it takes an object's name and sets the same origin. Location geometric read reads an object's geometric origin without changing it. Edit switches to edit mode. Vert select takes a list of vertex indices and selects them. It adds the vertices to a temporary group, and then it selects the group. Vert select all selects all vertices, then returns to object mode. And vert deselect does the opposite. Poly select selects a single polygon. Vert delete and poly delete delete the selected vertices or polygons of the selected object. Vert group vert group creates a vertex group. Vert group selects it, and vert group delete deletes it. Path short returns a list of vertices that represent the shortest path between two vertices. Most of these functions are more or less shortcuts. There's face, fill, extrude, inset, subdivide, merge, and triangulate, which first selects all the vertices of the object, and vert double, which removes double vertices, and flip, which reverses the normal of all polygons. Scale and translate transform the selected vertices. Poly to object separates the polygons of an object into new objects. And here I have an example of that. So if I first select this object and then run my script, it will take this object and turn it into a bunch of separate objects. Material adds a new material to an object. Material set sets a material. Matty text sets a texture on an object in the Blender engine. Image adds an image. Color vary is easier to demonstrate than to explain. It basically makes new variations for all the materials of an object. So here I have 3 different materials, and by default it will create 2 new materials for each of the existing, and it will create a darker variation and then a lighter variation and then a darker and then a lighter and so on. And so I've boolean this shield here using an array of planes set at different angles, and you can easily write a script that does that. So when I run this script, each polygon gets assigned a new variation, and this kind of thing can be used for floors or maybe windows. Shader has color returns true if a shader node has an RGBA input. Split by material can separate the polygons that have the same material. So here, if I revert this file and come back to this object, I've set this to select the yellow material. So when I run this script, which is pretty slow, it will take all the polygons that are yellow and put them into a new object, and delete the yellow polygons of the old object. And so here I'm deleting all materials that are not equal to the given material name, and that's a duplicated object. And then I reselect the original object and then delete all of the polygons that have the past material assigned. And so I get these two separate objects. Curve location places a curve index at a local location. Curve handle moves the handles of a curve to its points, and that makes the curve segment straight. And I sometimes use this to add a taper object to a mesh line. And these next functions are probably not something that most people are going to use. I use them because I don't like rigging and skinning. I usually just leave bones as separate meshes, then parent them to the torso. The result is kind of sloppy because the seams show, but the raw code that creates mesh deformations is somewhat complex, and I prefer the simplicity of rotating meshes to create animations. So when I model, I work on the left side, then use the char left to right to copy the left bones to the right side. Char align places the origin of child bones directly under the root. Frame sets the frame of the scene. Key rotation and location key the selected object. Key visibility keys the height attributes of an object. And legs and arms key the rotation of those bones. Horizon sets the background color of the scene. Visibility sets the height and height render attributes of an object. Shade sets smooth shading. Window clip sets the clipping in the 3D window. Like that. View color copies the diffuse color of a cycle's material into the viewport color. View to color does the opposite. It copies the viewport color into the diffuse color. Spot shadow sets use shadow on a spotlight. And these instance functions add new objects of a different type. Vert add creates a cube, then merges all the vertices into one. Curve adds a curve. Text takes a string and creates a text object. Camera and light, add a camera and a light. Vectdraw draws a vector, which is basically a cylinder and a cone. So here I have two vectors, and this orthogonal project function draws a third vector that's orthogonal to the first. So there's the first vector and the second vector, and there's an orthogonal vector. Loca read reads the location of a selected object. Scale and rota reads scale and rotation, and tran reads all three. Child returns a recursive list of all children of a selected root. Vert returns the local location of a vertex. Edge returns the local location of an edge. Polyvert returns a list of vertices that make up the polygon of a given index. Polyedge is the same except for edge keys. Polyattribute can return a value of a given attribute. So here I have another way to define the polysent and polynorm functions. They use the function tools module to set a default parameter on attribute. So if I wanted to get rid of this center function or this norm function, I could just use these instead. Personally, I don't mind the extra lines. I think it makes for more readable code. Distance returns the distance between 2 points. XYZ most returns the highest local point on an object for any axis. Axis is 2 by default, so if you want to find the height of a mesh, for example, you could also use it to define a bounding box for a mesh. XYZ most poly does the same thing, except it finds the most extreme point on a polygon. Z from XY is basically a downward array cast. So here I have some terrain, if you want to call it that, and the function will first triangulate this object by default to get rid of problems that might be caused by polygons that aren't flat. Like this one, for example. So if I wanted to place the 3D cursor directly on top of this terrain, I can pass the cursor location to the Z from XY function, and then I'll set the Z location to the return value. And it places the cursor directly on top of whichever polygon it was between in X and Y. So that can be used if you want to scatter objects on a terrain, for example. Vert select read returns a selected vertex. Edge and poly select are basically the same. Vert list select returns a list of selected vertices. Vert connect returns all vertices that are directly connected to a vertex. And these print functions print selections. Vert loca converts a list of vertex indices to a list of vertex locations. Edge loca does basically the same thing except for with an edge list. Vert index by location will take a world location and return a matching vertex index. Name sets the name of an object. Pad converts an integer to a string of width 3, which is how Blender differentiates instances. Instance reads an object string and returns the first numeric string it finds. instance replace replaces the instance section of a string. Find and replace finds a section of string separated by a period and replaces it with a different string for all objects. Scene name renames a scene. Scene new creates a new scene. Scene set sets the scene. The next functions delete the default objects in the default scene. Vert, edge, and polylist copy the lists of those elements, and down copies all three, and uploads an object. So you can use these functions to store, edit, and upload object geometry or create new objects from scratch. So here I can copy the geometry of a sphere by calling the download function. And then I can randomize the vertex locations and then re-upload it as a new object. Validates all meshes in the scene. Imports all objects from a separate blend file into the current blend file. And it's a little bit hacky because I haven't figured out how to read the objects in a blend file without opening it. So the function opens a new instance of Blender, then it writes an object list to a file. So that object list is then read in the current instance of Blender. So the first list holds options for the new instance of Blender to read. That gets written to a file. Then a Python expression is built and passed to the system console. Then the new object list is read and the objects are imported. Export is used by the new instance to export its objects to a file. Readlist converts the file into a format that Blender can use to append the objects. Import blend does the actual importing. Rename is used to fix naming conflicts. And texture append is for importing textures. Batch builds a command string for the console to execute a new instance of Blender. Rend adds batch render options. And expression adds the Blender command for a Python expression to a new string. These next functions randomize the values on specific texture nodes, and I use this to sort of mine textures. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I might do a video on how I do this at some point. I'm basically passing minimum and maximum ranges to be used to specify where I want a random float to fall. Or I also have the option to nudge an existing value, which will read a node and then shift it between some minimum and maximum of this nudge parameter. And these last functions are in the wrong library, so that was the end of the Blender functions. This one should go to Python. It's swap, it just swaps two variables. These other functions are supposed to be in the math library. Angle norm fixes the range of an angle. Angle difference returns the difference between two angles. Vec degrees and radians convert a tuple from one to the other. Vec to Euler 3D converts a 3D point into an Euler rotation. Vec pseudo rotate is a kind of inaccurate but fast rotation. Vect average returns the average point in a list of vectors to get like a location center of multiple objects, for example. Project ortho finds an orthogonal vector that lies in the same plane as the second vector. Engine scale multiplies each component of a vector by the corresponding component in scale. Engine Transform 3D can convert a local vertex location into a global vertex location, given the world scale, rotation, and location of the object. And the last function, EdgeLine, connects a list of vertices sequentially, and it can be used to graph functions, for example. So here I'm building a list of vertices based on the sine function, and the EdgeLine function just connects each previous vertex to the next vertex, and the math function can be set to whatever you want it to be, so you can make kind of like a graphing utility, basically. So I hope you found something in this video useful, and thank you for watching.